Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. As some of you probably know, I spent some time in Boston recently, including one spectacular evening where I got to see Steve Donoghue and his beautiful dog Frida, and also my fellow booktuber David Murphy, who has the ability to make even this social historian actually be interested in the history of war, and the wonderful Sam Sachs, who writes the fiction chronicle for the Wall Street Journal. While I've been watching David's channel and seeing Sam on Steve's video when he visits, and certainly reading his reviews, I hadn't met either of them before that night. Sitting in Steve's living room, absolutely surrounded by both books and deeply bookish people, and having calzones and more wine than I've had in total since the last time I was at Steve's house, was just an incredible joy. I spent more than a week in Boston, the first few days in the college club where I stayed last time I was in Boston. I'll talk about my room and the neighborhood in an upcoming video. And then I spent the rest of the time at my son's apartment, where I got to know his friends and roommates, some of whom I'd met before, and all of whom are amazing musicians and very kind people. We cooked great food together, watched an episode of Andor, an amazing show that I had not even heard of before, and attended an arts festival where my son participated, playing banjo as a bridge between a gospel choir and a bluegrass band. Fascinating. I also visited something like 10 different bookstores in the Boston area, and next time I'm in town, I have a couple more to visit. I'll be making a series of short videos about some of the books that popped out at me at those bookstores, as well as the very limited number of books I let myself bring home. But today, I want to have a short chat about a non-reading experience that I had right after I left the party at Steve's on my way back to my son's apartment for the night. It was 1 a.m., and my Uber driver was a friendly young man who was up for conversation, as so many drivers are in my experience. Although I'm sure none of the personal specifics would really identify anyone, I'm still going to try to obscure them a bit. Shortly after we said our hellos, my driver asked how long I had lived in the particular neighborhood in the Boston area where my son lives. I smiled and said I was just visiting the area and staying with my son. I told him how much I loved being in the city. And then I turned his question around. How long have you lived in the Boston area? He responded that he was from a specific country in West Africa, and he followed that with a lot of very specific details about his immigration status, his particular kind of visa, his sponsors, etc. And he told me how his first home in the country was another state in New England, a state I know is fairly rural and fairly purple. And then he moved to Boston, and he loved the urban environment full of so many different kinds of people. I mentioned that I grew up in an area of the U.S. where many people are descendants of people from his specific country and other places in West Africa, an area of Africa sometimes called the Rice Coast. Their ancestors had been seized there, sent in the bowels of ships across the Atlantic, and sold in the slave markets of the southern United States. A large number of people from Africa's rice coast were brought to work on the rice plantations in the humid, marshy areas of the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Initially, the white owners of those plantations had no experience with rice cultivation, certainly not with the physical labor, but really not even with the idea of how it should be done. And when those white plantation owners were purchasing slave labor, they specifically purchased people to work in their rice fields who did have experience working with rice. My Uber driver knew this story very well, and he seemed surprised that this old white lady knew it, and clearly pleased to hear me talk about it. I didn't mention that this history of rice plantations is what my father was studying and writing about when I was young. This young man then said he would very much like to visit that part of the country and get to meet some of the descendants of people from his country and region. Have you gotten to travel much since you came to the United States? I asked. He paused for a second, and the air just whooshed out of the car. I wondered if I had inadvertently asked some politically complex question. Couldn't people with visas travel in the States? And then the driver began talking very slowly and carefully, very gently and kindly, about why so many people living in poverty, or people who had immigrated to the U.S., sometimes had difficulties fitting into their communities, being accepted by their communities. Many are in desperate straits, often unable to find steady employment or housing, or sometimes enough food to feed their families. I made empathetic sounds as he spoke, but I was confused, trying to imagine how this conversation was going to lead to an answer about travels in the U.S. But my driver went on. He himself, as he explained in a tone of extreme gratitude, was lucky to have received an advanced education and to have the support of a particular widely known international corporation for whom he worked, etc. He was driving on his off hours until his baby was born so he and his spouse could afford a bigger apartment. As he told his story, several times he emphasized the word trouble, that he had never been in trouble here in the United States. And suddenly, I realized that he must have heard my question, have you gotten to travel much, as have you gotten in trouble much? Perhaps he misunderstood my question because I was speaking from the back seat while we were on an overpass and it was loud. Maybe it was because of the vestiges of my southern accent. Or maybe it was my sleepiness at 1 a.m. Or perhaps most likely it was because of the wild abundance of red wine and calzones that I had consumed at Steve's house. But my accent and the wine, etc., were only part of the reason, I suspect. The other influence is the current state of politics in this country. Not just the politics, but the experience on the street of ICE agents seizing immigrants, including people with appropriate visas, who've apparently not even been accused of anything more than minor parking infractions, if they've been accused of anything at all. That is what explained his incredible care in making sure I knew from the very beginning that he was here with a work visa, etc. That is why he was so clearly prepared to talk so carefully with his writers to protect himself and his family and his communities as much as he could. And probably that was one of the reasons that my accented and wine-slurred question might have so readily been heard in the way he heard it. Surely, this is a constant worry for him and for all of the other immigrant drivers, that they must have every single time they make an Uber or Lyft pickup, knowing the potential for being wrongfully reported and then targeted by federal agents, or maybe even becoming the victim of vigilante violence in a culture full of anti-immigrant rhetoric. I was horrified and ashamed as I got out of the car at my son's place. I had known what was happening here before I got in the car. I was already horrified from watching the video footage of people being seized and hearing horrible stories. And obviously, I knew that many people are afraid, and not only those who are most especially likely to be targeted in violent ways right now. Even some of us little old white ladies are sometimes afraid of what could happen to those of us who might speak up against this particular administration, about immigration issues, or about the decimation, or worse, of foreign aid or healthcare agencies, or the National Endowment for the Humanities, or the Association of Libraries and Museums, or the attacks on trans people, or even just the idea of trans people, or the financial threats and punishments on the nation's universities and law firms, the threats to voting rights of people of a lot of different stripes, the denial that people from discriminated groups might still be fully qualified for their jobs. All just horrifying and terrifying every day. Many of my friends have lost funding for their research, both in the humanities and in the health sciences. Many of my friends and neighbors in the DC area have lost their federal jobs. And my spouse, who was a physician and a healthcare policy researcher working for the federal government, probably would have lost his job since his agency is effectively being erased. All of this feels pretty immediate to me. The losses of government services that I thought made America great, so to speak, as well as the losses of jobs and livelihoods, and the fear of speaking up that such a large percentage of the country feels right now. But back to immigration specifically. I said a moment ago that I was ashamed. I live in an urban area, and I have close friends who are deeply connected to various immigrant communities. Still, somehow in that car at 1 a.m., talking to that young man, I not just knew what was happening, but finally felt it, or at least started feeling it. I had been so pleased with myself for knowing just a little about the history of West Africans in this country. But then I suddenly saw so much more. And, well, I don't quite know what to do, or even to say, except that it's about time I started feeling this way. Thanks for being here. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.